Okay, well, our last video cut off right when I was trying to say that the Exodus really was the crux of Israel's history and story when they found themselves enslaved in Egypt, and they cried out to God, and God heard the cry of the people and sent Moses to rescue them. And so it kind of becomes the constant story of Israel and God coming to Israel's rescue over and over and over again. God's faithfulness in the midst of Israel's enslavement, sometimes to countries and sometimes to their own idolatry and sin. There are lots of other important historical dates that you need to know. They are actually in page 14 of your textbook, so at your leisure, please go take a look at those and kind of figure out a general timeline of what's of Israel's history and what's going on in the life of Israel as a people. We're going to talk a little bit about the Hebrew canon. We have to talk first about the word canon. The word canon, it literally means measuring stick, but we use it in Christianity and other religions to refer to a collection of writings that becomes authoritative for a group of people. And so the canon, the Hebrew canon, is the collection of authoritative books for the Jews and for Christians. There's a wide range of time during which the books of the Old Testament were written, or the Jewish Bible. We believe, and this is rough, somewhere between 1200 and 200 BCE is when all of these books of the Old Testament were written. Please note that BCE is the same thing as BC, if that's what you're used to hearing. And then CE, when we get into CE, is the same thing as AD. So make sure you make note of that. So of these documents, all of these books that were written in this time period, they were mostly written in the Hebrew language, but you will see bits of Aramaic in several different parts after the Israelites found themselves in exile in Babylon, because they picked up the Aramaic language there. There are two main traditions, or maybe streams of texts, that make up the books of the Old Testament, and your book will talk more about this, the Masoretic texts and the Septuagint. So the Masoretic texts are all the traditions that are from the Hebrew language, and then the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. It comes later, is not the original writing. It comes later when the Israelites or the Jews are Hellenized or influenced by the Greek culture, and they begin to speak and write Greek. LXX is the abbreviation for the Septuagint. You can read more about the Masoretic text and the Septuagint in your book. But note that the oldest traditions, the oldest manuscripts, copies that we have are actually in Greek. They're from the Septuagint, because the Hebrew texts, the Masoretic texts, were usually burned because of the holiness of Scripture. They did not want them to fall into the wrong hands or to disintegrate. So the copies that we have that are older are actually the Greek copies of the Hebrew Scriptures. So the development of the canon it's a long process and complicated, but just to give you an overview. So the events that are recorded in the canon happened at various times throughout history, and as those events are happening, they're not written down immediately. These stories are told over and over and over again, from grandparents to grandchildren, sitting around the campfire, and we call this oral tradition. So, for example, say the story of Abraham and Sarah. It was told from Abraham and Sarah to their children, and then pass it on to their children, and then their children. So as the stories were passed down, particular traditions developed, different perspectives were added onto it. So it kind of gets shaped throughout its oral tradition. Some of these stories eventually are written down, and maybe in different forms. And then eventually, after many, many different stories are written down, they were collected into books. by what we sometimes call authors, but what they end up being really is editors. They're taking pieces of stories that were already written down and piecing them together into a larger book. The traditional Christian interpretation is that Moses was the editor for the Pentateuch or the Torah, and we can't prove that in any way. And definitely somebody else had a hand in it, because at the end of the Pentateuch, Moses dies, and so he could not be writing or editing that part when he was no longer living. So it's just important to note that as these stories are told and retold and shaped and written down, there are a lot of people contributing to these books, and sometimes even reinterpretation that comes into play later on, after, say, the Israelites were in exile. They look back on some of the events that had happened before, and they look at them in a different light. And so when they write them down, they may be interpreted from a different perspective. So it's just important to note the development of the canon is a long and complex process. So we've already gone over the different books and the different divisions of the Hebrew canon. But just to let you know, roughly we believe that the different sections were canonized or accepted as authoritative scriptures at various points in history. We believe that around 400 BC is when the Torah was canonized. Around 200 BC is when the prophets, or the Nevi'im, were all canonized, and that includes the former prophets and the latter prophets. And then it wasn't until much later, after the turn into CE, maybe around 100 CE, we're not sure about that, that the writings, Psalms and Proverbs and Ezra and Nehemiah, Esther, Ruth, all those books were not canonized until after really even the beginning of Christianity in around 100 CE. Just to give you a perspective, a sort of geographical, historical perspective on what area we're going to be talking about as we start with the Torah here in a little bit. Here is a map of the ancient Near East, and there are some important places that are going to be mentioned throughout our study of Genesis and on into the other books of the Bible. But over here is Babylon and Ur. When we get to the story of Abraham, we will see that is where Abraham is from. And when he is called by God to go to a land that God will show him, he heads across the Mesopotamian plains and the Mesopotamian Valley, actually, as we call it. And he ends up getting closer and closer to the Mediterranean Sea. And this is where, of course, modern day Israel is, and many other countries like Syria, Lebanon. Egypt will come into play both in Genesis and throughout the Old Testament, and down here is Egypt. So just to orient you geographically to where we are going to be as we start to study the Old Testament here. This will be the end of this lecture. We're going to jump into Genesis really soon. So I hope to see you soon. Thanks.